Welcome to this screencast on meteor-example-form. I want to walk through the code for you. The idea is how to manipulate forms using semantic UI, Blaze, and Meteor 1.4, and not using autoform, which is the easy way to do it if you've got a situation where autoform works for you. Now to note that the code is structured according to the format in this other sample system I developed called Meteor Application Template. So before looking at this, you'll want to look at that template and understand it, because I'm not going to really cover those aspects of this application here. You want to learn about Blaze templates. This is the authoritative reference for that. You'll want to learn about semantic UI forms. You go here to learn about them. And to validate the data, we're using simple schema, and there's a section in there on validating data. That's good to look at. And finally, to display the correct things in the page, we use a reactive dictionary, and I find this documentation to be pretty good, so I'm referring you there. Okay, before we get started, it might be good just to see how the application worked. There's only 2 pages. The home page comes up. It looks like this. If we try to submit this form without putting anything in, we get error messages, and then as we fill in data and try to submit it, we see that error messages go away until eventually, if we select enough stuff and we submit it, then it's valid. And what happens is this success message pops up that says you can actually edit that document you just created by going to this URL. So we go to this URL, which is basically student data and then the doc ID. It displays the information in the document that we created and allows us to, change it in various ways. My bio. And then if we click update, we see this message that comes out that says the student data was successfully updated. So that's all there is. There's just basically 2 pages. One to create a new document and another one to edit pre-existing document where the URL specifies what that document is. We're going to use collection 2, simple schema, and reactive dictionary. Those are the applications beyond those from Meteor Application Template that are needed. I went through the walkthrough. So let's quickly go through the code. And to validate the data, we need to have a schema, and this is the page that does that. We're using simple schema, so we're basically saying name is required, has to be a string of 50, bio is optional, hobbies turn out to be optional because they can just be an empty string, level is required because it's a required string, GPA is also required, and majors is optional because it could be an empty array. Okay, and so we have to we publish all of the student data. It turns out in this particular application we could only publish the specific document that we're editing, and that would work fine as well. But to simplify things a little bit, we're going to publish all the data. And then I talk about the fact that when we are editing, when we're publish the data in the Edit Student Data page, it's a little complicated, and we get this stuff going on because of the fact that Semantic UI wants to load some JavaScript through the use of jQuery, and based upon the data that's available. In order to do all of those things, we essentially have to embed a callback inside the after flush method, which is itself a callback to this template subscribe, so that we can get the drop downs and the checkboxes and the radio buttons to work correctly using Semantic UI. Pretty painful, but I think this is code that you can just kind of cut and, like boilerplate, you can cut and paste into your own use of Semantic UI with Meteor, and it should be fine. Note that some of these are not in the Semantic UI documentation for what needs to be actually selected, but I found that I needed to add these additional calls in my case. Okay, so let's now look at the Create Student Data page. Here's the HTML for it, and it's pretty straightforward. The first thing is that when you're creating a semantic UI form, you add one of two classes to this UI form. The class is attached to the form element. If you have the class success, the string success in there, then any message fields, okay, any div class UI success message will be displayed. If you have the error, the string error, or the class error in that the set of classes, then any UI error messages will be displayed. All of them will be displayed. So the way this form works is when it's initially displayed, neither success class nor both success class and error class return the empty string. So neither of them are displayed. So neither the success nor the error messages are displayed. Then when you try to actually invoke the form, depending upon validation, one or the other, but not both of these, will be displayed, resulting in either the specific error messages being displayed or the success message at the bottom being displayed. Now, because semantic UI is going to display all, if it sees error in here, because it's going to display all the fields that have all the div classes that say UI error message, we actually have to use a template helper method to figure out whether or not this specific field had an error, and if so, if that's the case, then we insert that div. So that's the logic there. Here we see example of this. We have a display field error. It takes a parameter, which is the field of interest, and then if that particular field had an error as a result of validation, then this div is going to be in the resulting HTML that's presented. Okay, down here we're just showing this is how we do it for successes. We just have a helper method which determines whether or not the validation was successful, and if so, we get that HTML being inserted. Okay, let's look at the JavaScript side. On the side of the create data, we are going to create a reactive dictionary, and this has two things in it: a display success message and a display error message key. And they're both set to false, which means initially we're not going to have either that error or success class in the form, so it's just going to not display any of those messages. And then we're going to update those variables as in the event that handles the form validation, and because they're reactive, that will result in re-rendering the page and inserting the fields in there. We also create a named context for our student data schema. This is following the advice in the simple schema documentation, and we'll name it with the name of the template so that each template can have its own validation stuff going on. Okay, and then we got the helper functions for this page, and basically we have one helper function that's going to return the string success, which will insert the success class into that form class area, or the empty string if we shouldn't be displaying the success class. Same exact thing for error. We check to see if there's this error messages flag has been set. If so, then that error class will be inserted into the form. This is the helper that decides, shows what the display success message is. That's the way we get that link in the create data page that takes us to the update page, because display success message actually can hold the ID. And then this display field error is a helper that takes the name of a field, looks up that field name in the set of error keys to determine whether or not that field is actually whether that field should be displayed or not as an error. So invalid keys, after we run validation, is going to be a set of key value pairs where the keys are the names of the fields, and then we run the underscore function find over that list of error keys, checking to see whether or not the name field of that object is equal to the field name that we passed in. Okay, on rendered, this is because we have no actual subscription for this page. It's just a blank form. then we don't have to do that, that crazy callback stuff. But we do want to load this JavaScript so that the semantic UI form controls look nice. And then finally we have the event to take care of what happens when the user presses submit on the create student data page. We start off by preventing the default behavior, which is kind of standard in Meteor for these event handlers. And then we're going to get the various fields out of the event. So this is how you do it for a text field. This is how you do it for a text area. This is how you do it for a set of checkboxes. This is how you do it for a radio button. This is how you do it for single selection. This is how you do it for multiple selection. So I'm just showing you how to do it for these various form controllers. Once you've done that, then I create an object that contains all those values. I reset the validation so that we start without, because we might have been gotten head errors before, and we need to get those out so that we're always starting from scratch whenever we do a validation. And then we call clean, and this is important because whenever you do an insert, Simple Schema is going to invoke this clean on it before it tries to insert it in the database. So we should invoke it as well so that the results of validation here are going to be the same as the results of validation when we actually do the insert. Okay, if you don't call this clean, then you may validate correctly here, but the insert will fail because it did a clean and that changed the structure of the objects, and all of a sudden things don't work. Okay, so we do the clean, we do the validate. As a result of this validate, we have these reactive variables being set, one of them being this isValid function, which determines whether or not there were any errors. If it is valid, if it's true, then we insert the data into the student data collection, and we set our flags, the success flag, to be truthy. In other words, it will be the ID of this new object that's created, and the error message will be false. So as soon as we do this setting, then the page will re-render, and we will not have any more error messages displayed if we had some displayed before. Plus, we'll have that little message at the bottom saying, oh, you can go to this, follow this, click on this link to go to the update. On the other hand, if it's not valid, that means there were errors. So we set the display message to be false, so get rid of that, and we set display error messages to be true. That was a reactive variable which will end up re-rendering the page, and now all those error message divs will be displayed. Okay, HTML is very similar. One thing you need to do is make sure that the subscriptions are ready, because now you're rendering data from the underlying database in the page itself. And then what else? I say the other significant thing is that we have, oh yeah, so now we have to actually put data into the form, and so I show you the way to do that on this page. So usually it's the value field, except here, where it's not the value field, it's between the text area things. Well, I guess it's not always the value field at all. In the case of a text field, it's the value field. In the case of a text area, you put it between the text area elements. And then in the case of checkboxes, you have this checked, and then we call this helper function to see whether or not the surfing checkbox should be checked. In the case of radio buttons, again, you can use this level. You have a helper function level checked with the radio button value to indicate whether or not it should be checked or not. And then you have a selected thing for the drop-down menus. Okay, so you kind of work through this, and depending on what control you need to use in your own form, you can see here how to populate it with data from the underlying document. Okay, on the JavaScript side, we need to subscribe to student data. This is a reasonable way to do that. And here are the helper functions. You can see we have one that returns the value of a field, and we're using this notation where first we get the student data object, but before returning a value, we check to make sure that that value is defined. This is because it turns out in Meteor, sometimes, depending on the order in which things are run, you may encounter this return statement before this reactive value variable has a value. So we do this thing to make sure that student data is truthy before we try to access the field name. And you can see that happening in all of these. It's a little bit strange to me. I wish it wasn't this way, but according to this URL right here, this is indeed the way things work in Meteor. And then finally, I went through this before, but you have to have this whole tracker after flush stuff to make sure that you get your JavaScript code for the semantic UI controls invoked appropriately after everything has been rendered. Okay, that is the code, and I hope you find meteor example form useful for your own development.